In bonds, there are two parties. One, a borrower who needs money, a lender who wants to lend money. In India, the borrowers are corporates and government. And you might think, why does government wants to borrow? And the logic is simple. Government makes revenue in the form of taxes, and then they have expenditure. There's a lot of subsidies, and they have to build roads, dams, bridges, metros, and things like that. The revenue is less, the expenditure is more. The difference between them is basically called deficit, and government has to borrow money from the market to bridge this deficit. And they issue bonds called as government bonds. Now, if the center is issuing bond, they are called GSEC. If the state is issuing bond, they are called as state development loans, SDLs as short form. Now, in a bond, there are two kinds of risk. One is credit risk, and second is interest rate risk. In these bonds, you don't have to worry about credit risk because government bonds ideally cannot default. And the answer is simple. Government can always print money to pay back. So government bonds are risk-free. But from an interest rate risk perspective, they do have interest rate risk. And in fact, they can have very high interest rate risk if the tenure of the bond is very high. For the benefit of all who are new to this concept of interest rate risk, let us take a simple example of a seesaw. In a seesaw, if one person goes down, the other moves up, and when this person comes down, the first person moves up. Similarly, the bond prices fluctuate in the market based on the tenure of the bond. Now, when interest rate comes down, the value of the bond goes up, and when interest rate moves up, the value of the bond goes down. It's like a seesaw. But by what fluctuation will happen based on changes of interest rate predominantly depends upon the tenure of the bond. If the tenure of the bond is short, the fluctuation is very less. The tenure of the bond increases, the fluctuation increases. But now if the tenure of the bond is high, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, the fluctuation of the bonds will be quite higher. Now, if you are taking a long-term government bond or long-term gilt funds into your portfolio, you don't have credit risk, but you have interest rate risk into your portfolio. Because when interest rate changes, the valuation of the bonds can be quite high. In gilt funds, you can have two kind of options. One is constant maturity long-term papers. So these funds will constantly have like a 10-year or more, and they're like fixed tenure papers. Then obviously these funds will have higher fluctuation based on changes of interest rates. Also, there is another category of the fund. These are called dynamically managed gilt funds. Here, based on the view of a fund manager automatically changes the tenure of the paper based on his view. So if his view is that interest rates will come down, he will take long-term papers. So when rates come down, if you take long-term papers, the value of the bond goes up, you make good returns. And at the same time, if his fund manager's view is that rates will increase, he will reduce the tenure of the papers so that the losses are quite restricted. So in these funds, the tenure of the bond is dynamically managed. Gilt funds should only be used for those investors who have a very high risk appetite, who are looking for high returns, and also comfortable with volatility which they have to go in the entire journey. I hope you understood the principle of gilt funds. Happy investing, stay invested.